My name is Don Edmunds. We're going to tell a little story on this car, how it came to be and what the goal was in building it. I built race cars in Southern California from 1962 to 1982, and this is sort of, I consider it the best car I ever built. In 1961, Jack Brabham came to Indy with a rear-engine Cooper race car that had a very small engine in it. He qualified well. He finished ninth in the race, but it was noticeable how well he went through the corners. The car was really handled well. Being a rear-engine car, people focused on the rear engine. I was more focused on the chassis because I was just about to open my own shop to start building race cars, and I couldn't imagine building a rear-engine car with solid axles. In the past, I worked for Bill Devon and Bill Strop, Bill Thomas, and most importantly of all, Ed Kuzma. And I felt I was, ready to open my own shop. So Dave Kimmel and I worked together and put together a catalog on the parts that I intended to build and sell. And so in the last page of the catalog, because of what I had seen at the Speedway with Jack Brabham in the little Cooper, I put an article that said, "Independent suspension in your future." That if we didn't go to independent suspension at Indy, we would see that in a number of years that most of the drivers that came up through the traditional deal, sprints and midgets, would be shut out, and that Indy would be taken over primarily by foreign drivers. So opened the shop, proceeded to build a few things. Well, I had some independent suspension experience, but not near enough. I had designed and built the Bill Thomas Cheetah, which was independently suspended, and apparently got lucky on that one because it was handled fairly well, and that's about the best you'd put it. Then I built a rear-engine Indy car for Gordon Van Lew, the VitaFresh Special. It was four-wheel independent with a rear-engine offie, and it wasn't too successful. It was pretty bad. But anyway, I went on building sprints and midgets and built up a pretty good business, actually. But I'd always been concerned that this independent suspension thing was stuck in the back of my head. Now I had, like I say, some experience with the two, semi-successful cars that I built. And so based on that and the fact that I worked somewhat with Roman Slobodinsky when we did some work for Dan Gurney's outfit, I decided in 1972 that I would try to go the independent suspension car myself. We had never been able to sell one to anybody. So I built this roadster layout car. It's a midget offie roadster. I drove it myself the first time out, and it felt very comfortable to me. The car felt good. So we had a race coming up on the mile at Phoenix, and Lee Kunzman was hired to drive it. We had an engine that had been provided by Howard Linney, which was an older offie that he had actually sent out for a vintage car I was restoring. And Linney was noted for his killer offies, but when it got down to it, the killer offie wasn't ready, so we went over there with the engine that had been prepared for my vintage car. When we got there, Kunzman was very fast in warm-ups and hot laps. Qualifying came. He set a new track record and fast time by almost a full second over the other cars. This didn't go over too well with the old timers over there. The hardline USAC guys were not happy with the change that this car could have brought about. So they've basically told me I had to cut off the front of the nose, which they called a wing. I didn't want to cut on the car because I didn't want to cut on it. Plus, the old offie engine, I didn't have any faith that it would run 100 miles. So we loaded it up and took it home, having no idea that that was more or less the end of the road for the car. The next time it ran, Howard took it to IRP out of Indianapolis. Steve Chassis was to drive the car. I talked to Steve, and he said the car was super fast during warm-ups. He went out when he got ready to qualify, Howard told him the car had been sold. It was sold to Kevin Fisher from Australia. And so I was not aware of any of this was going on. So Monday, after, thinking the race was on Sunday and not knowing what had happened, I get a call from Howard, and he says, "I got a good buck for that son of a bitch." And I'm saying, you got a good buck for what? He says, the Roadster. I sold the Roadster. Well, I almost dirtied my pants because I did not consider the car being for sale. So the next thing I know, the car is off to Australia, and, you know, I got paid for it, but that was about it. When the car got to Australia, they tried to run it once or twice, and then the group that ran midget racing in Australia outright banned the car. Fisher sold the car to George and Joe Tatnall, and they were on their way from Adelaide back to Sydney with the car when they heard on the radio that the car had been banned. So they took it home. George just stuck it in his barn and moved it around a few places over the years, but the car stayed in storage. And I had heard, I used to try to find out whatever happened to it. And the car, all I knew was it was in Australia, and I knew nothing about where it was or who had it. I heard the name George Tatnall a couple of times, but when I talked to George, he just didn't have anything he wanted to sell. And I just kind of let it go. Now, this was almost 40 years ago, between 35 and 40 years ago, that the car was off to Australia. So about 6 years ago, I was over in Medford, Oregon, which is near where I live here. And I knew that Brooke Tatnall, George's son, was running with the World of Outlaws. So there was a World of Outlaws truck parked by a motel, and the guy was working on a car in there. So I went over and asked him. I said if Brooke Tatnall would be in town and if he'd see him. And he said, yeah, Brooke will be here. So I gave him my card and said, would you give Brooke my card and get him to give me a call? Lo and behold, about a week later, I get a call from Brooke. And I asked him about the Roadster. He says, it's my dad's barn, and it's in great shape. So he sent me some pictures, and there was the Roadster all covered with dust, but I could see that it looked relatively intact. So I immediately tried to buy it. I got a hold of George and made first I asked him what he had, and he had the car, and I made a strong offer for it. I wanted the car really bad, so I offered him way too much for it. And a year or so, but he wasn't sure he wanted to sell. So in about 2 years, he sounded like, yeah, he thought he would sell it. So we're getting close now. My son, who's the director of testing for Edmunds.com, was over to Australia on a business trip, and he went over to George's place and took pictures of the car, and I could see that, wow, I really want it back. So everything was going along well, and then George passed away. And, so then his widow and his brother Joe were then the owners of the car, but I don't vulture well at all. So I just backed off, and I told Brooke that if they ever wanted to sell it, I was still interested. So another 2 years went by, and I get a call from Brooke, and he says, the car's available. So we did a little bit of shuffling with the price, not much. I had to pay a little more than I had offered. And so I had a friend, Gordon Benny, over in Australia that had bought some cars from me in the past, and he offered to kind of bird dog it on that end for me. So when it got around to where the car was, ready to go, Gordon picked it up, took it, got it crated, got it on a ship, got it headed over. Now let me tell you, when this started, every morning I woke up worrying about this car. For 5 years, I'd been worrying about it. So finally, it's on the ship. Okay, so now it's on the ship. So I get on the internet where I can see that the ship movements. And so here's I can't remember the name of the ship, but here's the ship sitting in the ocean. I think, great. So the next day I look and it's still sitting in the same place. It's still sitting in the same place. I found out that you have to pay money if you want to actually see the movement of the ship each day. But it finally arrived in Long Beach, and we got it up here to Brookings, Oregon, where I live now. And I've had a nice trailer built for it so I can haul it around a little bit. And I'm converting the end of my shop here to kind of a shrine to this Roadster. But you can't believe how nice it is to have this thing back. I feel that I was trying to prove a point on how important independent suspension would be to the guys that came up the ladder with sprints and midgets. It used to be in the 50s, the 40s, 50s, and even in the early 60s that solid axle race cars were what everybody drove. But it just seemed to me, after seeing that Brabham's performance, that the time was coming that we had to go to independent suspension. The problem is they're still running the same solid axle race cars in sprints and midgets, and there's a couple of things about it that are bad. To start with, the solid axles are like a pole vault. You know, that's why these cars are tumbling all the time. They get up on the two wheels and over they go. They bicycle and turn over and flip and God knows what all. And to me, I compare it to a pole vaulter. If you took a pole vaulter and put a hinge in his pole, he wouldn't go very far. And that's the same way it is with these race cars. Independent suspension, in addition to making the car handle better, saves lives. There's no question about it. I was never really sure exactly why the car was run out of the country. I think it was primarily politics. People just didn't want to see a car so different that was so obviously fast that they would have to switch over. One of the things that I did when I built this car, I tried to keep the costs down. I always said I could have sold this car for $1,200 more than I was selling the standard 4-bar midgets we were primarily building at the time. Everything on this thing is Hallebrand. The hubs are all Hallebrand. The rear axle is a Hallebrand quick change with the axles modified to take in for the independent suspension. And I made a deal where I disengaged the change gears to get a neutral. The front spindles are Econoline. The steering is a Schroeder. I mean, this is all familiar parts. The car was not going to be more expensive. When you're building, it's a tube frame car. When you're building a tube frame for this car or a tube frame for a 4-bar, the tubing doesn't know the difference, and it doesn't take that much longer to do it. The U-joints that I used were some Chrysler pot joints. All those parts were available at the local auto parts store. There was nothing from overseas or anything really expensive went into this thing. It was just made out of the shocks. The shocks that I used were a bunch of things that I picked up at a surplus store. So the car was not expensive to build, or would not have been expensive to build to sell. I spent a lot of time on this one, I'll tell you. But no, and so I could never quite understand what it was all about. The reason given was what they called a wing on the front, which I consider just a fairing behind the front bumper. Now, I did make wings so that I thought as the car progressed, we could maybe go to what they would let us run wings, but the car never really got to race. It only got to qualify here. And so at any rate, the first time I took the car out, I drove it myself, and I tried it at Madera Speedway, and it felt really good. Then I tried it at the Orange Show. Well, the people running the show at Orange Show were people I used to race with, so they let me try it with and without the wing. And I found out with the wing, the car definitely did not handle well at all. It needed more wing on the front if it was ever going to run with the wing. But the car was never run at Phoenix or Madera or at IRP with the wing. It was run always without a wing. Learning what I do know about independent suspension, which isn't a lot. In 1964, I built a car for Gordon Van Lew, the VitaFresh car, and it was a disaster suspension-wise initially. I knew after we had been there for a while and going out in the corners and watching the car run that there were big problems somewhere. Well, that year, Colin Chapman was there with two Lotus cars, so it just happened to garage right next to us. And the old garages at the Speedway were, you know, usually the doors were open because they were small and the weather could be hot. So what I did, I just kind of kept an eye out, and when one of the cars would be there with the nose off and the front suspension, let's say, exposed, I would quietly take a pack of cigarettes and go over and put it down in front of the car. Now, I don't smoke, but I know what size a pack of cigarettes is. Then I'd wait until I could do the same thing at the rear suspension. You know, it took a week or so to get these pictures. And then when I got home, after we had missed the show with the VitaFresh car, when I got home, I blew it up on the wall, and with the cigarette packages giving me a reference, I could do some crude measurements on the suspension. I immediately found that where my problem was is my roll centers were just all over the ballpark, where on the Lotus cars, the roll centers remained constant through bump and droop. And that's the thing that I learned about independent suspension that is changed it all for me, and that's one of the reasons this car was as successful as it was in its limited way. So at any rate, and what I did realize, if this car would have been accepted and would have run and been allowed to run, it wouldn't have been very long till somebody would have come along and blown me out of the tub, because there's a lot I never did learn about independent suspension. I learned some of the basics, and that's all that it took with this car to be able to beat the solid axle cars I was running against. But if people in Europe or more knowledgeable people in the States would have taken an interest, I'd have had about 6 months and I'd have been history. Okay, thanks for looking at this. I just wanted the story of this car to get out. The car means a lot to me. And like I say, it's the best car I ever built. And it's never going to be restored. It'll just stay the way it came back from Australia.